Do you know this song by Bob Dylan? You may be an ambassador to England or France. You may like to gamble. You may like to dance. You may be the heavyweight champion of the world. You may be a socialite with a long string of pearls, but you're going to have to serve somebody. Yes, indeed, you're going to have to serve somebody. Well, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. I think if the Apostle Paul heard Dylan sing that song, he'd say, yes, that pretty much sums up my letter to the Romans. When Paul was writing and preaching, a third of the population in the Roman Empire was enslaved. Slavery was the engine of Rome's economy. If you weren't a slave, you still saw human beings treated as property every day on the streets. So Paul chose this ubiquitous institution as his metaphor for spiritual and ethical allegiance. What master will we serve? It's a metaphor that doesn't sit well with our modern ideas of freedom, independence, and equality. I don't want to be anyone's slave. And I don't want to be in a relationship with a God that sees me that way, as property from whom any obedience can be demanded. But Paul had an ancient worldview, not our modern one. And so he says we are either a slave to sin or we are a slave to righteousness. There is no third option where we just get to be our own boss and have what we would think of as freedom. For him, freedom comes in having the option to choose our master, whether it's, as Bob Dylan puts it, the devil or the Lord. And for all we might fiercely defend our political or our personal freedom, Paul and Bob Dylan might just be right. We are all serving something or somebody by how we spend our time, our money, and our energy. Maybe we're serving our own bank account or the people who engineer our phone and its apps to be so addictive, or even our commitment to eating healthy or exercising, our desire to be seen as a good person. All of these things can become our master if we let them. We might have chosen these masters, but we've still given them a lot of control, often unconsciously. And Paul wants us to understand that the master that we choose shapes our lives. And so we should choose righteousness rather than sin. Let's talk about sin for a second. When we read Paul or we hear him read aloud in church, we carry the baggage of 2,000 years of Christian tradition that often distorted healthy human relationships to our body, to our gender, and our sexuality. His letters have been wrongly weaponized against LGBTQ plus people and are the foundation for the harmful purity culture that has led to so much shame and repression. But that's not really what Paul meant. He isn't actually talking about a puritanical morality at all. For Paul, sin is an anti-God power that has sway over the human condition. It isn't the times when we mess up a little bit and stray from our ideals with a harsh word or an unkind thought. Sin is the hostile, systemic forces of oppression for the sake of power and greed. Forces that lead to exploitation of the poor and the marginalized. forces that held humanity captive in Rome and still hold us captive today. Being a slave to sin is a kind of idolatry where our worship of power, wealth, and our own desires shapes our actions. And sin leads to suffering, not because God is punishing us, but because on this path we hurt others, and ultimately we hurt ourselves. On the other hand, being a slave to righteousness means aligning ourselves with God's goodness. And on this path, we learn to want what God wants for us, what is good for us and for others. That's a stark contrast to the exploitation and oppression of the Roman culture. Maybe it's because I'm a Gen Xer, but I hate to be told what to do. I hate the idea of obedience. Anybody else out there?
Hi. I'm a teenager.
But I do want to do what's morally right. What's right for me, what's right for others, and what's right for the world. And seeking that righteousness is the path. Seeking that rightness is the path of righteousness. So with that little mental translation to my 21st century worldview, I can get behind what Paul and Bob Dylan are saying. I'm going to have to serve somebody. And I want it to be the goodness and righteousness of God. The story of the binding of Isaac that we heard today certainly raises this question of obedience and who we serve. It's a really hard story. Abraham and Isaac lived with a worldview even older than Paul's, and in a time and place where child sacrifice was seen as a way to placate or win a God's favor in dire circumstances. So Abraham is not shocked by his God's instruction. But in the end, the God of Abraham does not demand Isaac's death, ultimately honoring the covenant promise to make a great nation of Abraham and Sarah's descendants. We have a little Tuesday online spiritual formation group that meets every week, and we're reading a little book called The Love That Is God. It's by a modern theologian named Frederick Bauerschmidt. We just read the first chapter last week. Bauerschmidt's premise is that love is God's fundamental nature and identity. And that when we understand this, we also understand ourselves to be created from that love and therefore wholly lovable without having to do or earn anything. He contrasts this with the stories of the Roman gods, who were petty and vindictive and violent in their desires to best each other. And unsurprisingly, the desire to dominate defined Roman culture.
And the desire to one up other people.
Mm-hmm. Similarly, a God who demands a human sacrifice to guarantee a plentiful harvest is not acting in love. But the story of the binding of Isaac, for all the ways that it disturbs our modern sensibilities, ultimately shows the God of Abraham revealing God's nature as love, not as violence or domination. You're going to have to serve somebody. Yes, indeed, you're going to have to serve somebody. Well, it might be the devil or it might be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. My heart is very full with love and appreciation for the way the people of Holy Family strive to walk the path of righteousness. That's why we're here. We know who we want to serve, but we're still human beings.
No, not.
And we live in a world swayed by those systemic forces of oppression and exploitation that we call sin. They influence us. Sometimes they make us afraid. Sometimes they cause us to lose hope. Sometimes our thinking gets trapped in the narrow categories those forces want us to, that those forces want to define. So we can't connect with people who are different or work together to solve the world's problems. Paul is inviting us to reckon with how we spend our time and our money and our energy, and to ask ourselves, do our everyday choices serve the God of love? Or do they send us spinning around some other master? What does serving righteousness actually look like in our daily lives? What concrete choices can we make? It means when our culture demands we serve the idol of endless productivity, we choose the righteousness of resting and caring for our bodies. It means when the algorithm of our phone tries to make us serve anger and outrage, we log off and choose the righteousness of a real conversation with a friend or neighbor. It means when political forces demand that we serve fear by excluding the marginalized, we choose the righteousness of radical and defiant hospitality. We're going to serve somebody. And the joy of a community like Holy Family is the support and the companionship of one another along the path of righteousness. Together, we strive to give our time and our resources and our hearts to God's goodness, sharing God's love with those who need it most. In a world that desperately needs to hear that God does not want violence, judgment, or exclusion, but only and always love.